Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most legendary names in Viking history, but whether he was a real man or a myth stitched together, from many is still debated. What isn't debated is how his story ends. By the mid-9th century, Ragnar had already built a reputation that echoed across Europe, raiding Francia, clashing with Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, becoming a name kings feared before ever seeing his ships. But one final campaign changed everything. Around 865 AD, he launched a raid into Northumbria that went disastrously wrong. His forces were defeated, and he was captured by King Ella. What followed wasn't a quick execution. It was a message. Ella chose the snake pit. Ragnar was thrown into a dark chamber filled with venomous serpents. Coils shifting, bodies sliding over stone, nowhere to stand, nowhere to escape. And according to the sagas, Ragnar didn't beg, he didn't panic, he laughed. As the snakes closed in, he is said to have spoken his final words, not of fear, but of vengeance, warning Ella that his sons would come, and when they did, they would make him pay. Whether that moment truly happened or not doesn't matter, because the story didn't end in that pit. It spread, and soon after a massive Viking force, the great heathen army, arrived in England, not just to conquer, but to avenge a man who may or may not have ever existed. Ivar the Boneless. Ivar the Boneless was one of the most feared Viking warlords of the 9th century, a name that carried enough weight to terrify entire kingdoms before a single ship touched shore. Yet even his identity is surrounded by uncertainty. His strange nickname debated for centuries, some claiming it meant he lacked bones, others that he possessed unnatural flexibility or a rare condition. But whatever the truth was, it never slowed him down. Ivar became a central leader of the great heathen army, the same force that swept into England after Ragnar's death, tearing through Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with calculated brutality. He didn't just fight, he ruled, eventually establishing himself as King of Dublin, where historical records describe him as a figure of immense power who controlled both Norse and Irish politics with precision. A strategist as much as a warrior, a man who turned chaos into control and built influence far beyond the battlefield. But for someone who reshaped entire regions, his ending feels almost unreal. There is no final stand, no betrayal, no legendary last words. Around 873 AD, Ivar simply dies, reportedly from sudden illness. Not in war, not in conquest, but in silence. No saga lingers on the moment. No dramatic scene was preserved. The man who made kings fear the horizon didn't fall to a blade. He disappeared into obscurity, and somehow that absence feels heavier than any violent death. Because there is nothing to remember, only the unsettling fact that one of the most dangerous men of the Viking age did not die like a legend, he died like anyone else. Rollo of Normandy. Rollo of Normandy began his life as a relentless Viking raider, the kind of man who didn't just attack kingdoms, but wore them down over time, repeatedly striking the Frankish lands until resistance became pointless. His campaigns were so persistent that the Frankish king Charles the Simple made a decision that sounds almost unthinkable. Instead of trying to defeat him, he negotiated. In 911 AD, the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte granted Rollo land in what would become Normandy, on the condition that he convert to Christianity and defend the region from other Vikings. And just like that, a raider became a ruler, a pagan warlord transformed into a Christian duke. But the transition was never as clean as it looked. According to near-contemporary accounts, Rollo never fully abandoned his old beliefs. And shortly before his death, he reportedly ordered the sacrifice of 100 Christian prisoners to the Norse gods, as if unwilling to choose one side over the other, hedging his place in both worlds. His life became a strange balance between two identities, conqueror and protector, pagan and Christian, destroyer and founder. And his death reflects that same quiet contradiction. Sometime between 928 and 933 AD, Rollo died of old age, not in battle, not in conflict, but as an established ruler. The man who once terrified entire kingdoms ended his life governing one. And perhaps the most lasting part of his legacy isn't the fear he created, but what came after. Because from that land he was given, his descendants would go on to reshape Europe itself. Björn Ironside. Björn Ironside was the kind of Viking leader whose life feels almost exaggerated, even by saga standards. A man who didn't just raid nearby shores, but pushed far beyond what most dared to attempt, leading expeditions deep into the Mediterranean at a time when few Norse warriors had ever seen those waters. Alongside his ally Hastein, he sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, striking parts of modern-day Spain, North Africa, and Italy, attacking cities that had never faced Viking longships before. And in one of the most infamous moments of his career, they sacked a city they believed was Rome, only to later realize it was actually Luna, a mistake that would have been almost laughable if it hadn't come with so much destruction. After years of successful campaigns and a reputation that stretched across continents, Björn reportedly returned north and ruled as a king in Sweden. His name solidified as one of the great explorers and raiders of the Viking Age, but for someone who lived such a vast and dangerous life, his ending is almost unsettling in its simplicity. There is no final battle, no betrayal, no heroic last stand. According to saga tradition, Björn Ironside died of old age, quietly, without spectacle. The man who carried war across seas simply stopped, and somehow that silence feels almost wrong. Erik Bloodaxe. Erik Bloodaxe earned his name in a way few rulers ever could, not through legend or exaggeration, but through blood. After the death of his father, Harald Fairhair, Erik moved quickly to secure the Norwegian throne, eliminating several of his own brothers in the process. According to the sagas, he and his wife Gunhild were responsible for the deaths of multiple half-siblings, turning a royal succession into something closer to a purge. For a time it worked. He became king of Norway, feared and uncontested, but power taken that way rarely lasts. His surviving brother Håkon the Good eventually drove him out, forcing Erik into exile. Where he didn't disappear, he adapted, carving out a new position as ruler of Northumbria, taking the throne of York not once but twice, a king without a stable kingdom, constantly shifting between power and loss. But his story doesn't end in quiet exile or old age. It ends the same way it began, in violence. In 954 AD at the Battle of Stainmore, Erik was killed in what appears to have been an ambush. Some sources point to betrayal, possibly orchestrated by local rulers who had once tolerated him. Others suggest he was simply outmaneuvered, but the detail that remains is this. He died not as a secure king, but as a target, cut down in a narrow pass far from any throne. The man who killed his way into power was ultimately undone by someone else willing to do the same. Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson is remembered as the Viking who reached North America nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, sailing west from Greenland around the year 1000 and landing in a place he called Vinland, a coastline now widely believed to be part of modern-day Canada, confirmed by archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows, an achievement that should have made him one of the most documented explorers in history. Yet his story takes a strange turn. Unlike most figures of his time, Leif's life doesn't build toward a dramatic ending. There is no final battle, no betrayal, no legendary death scene preserved in detail. After returning from his voyages and helping spread Christianity in Greenland, largely influenced by his mother, he simply fades out of the record. Historians estimate he died around 1020 AD, but there is no clear account of how, where, or even why. The sagas that celebrate conquest and glorify violent endings offer almost nothing about his final moments, which is unusual, almost suspicious, for a figure of his importance. It's as if the story just stops following him. The man who walked on a continent unknown to Europe quietly disappears from history. No spectacle, no closure, no defined ending. And maybe that's what makes it stand out the most. Because while other Vikings are remembered for how they died, Leif Erikson is remembered for what he found, and then for vanishing without a trace. Olaf Haraldsson. Olaf Haraldsson, later known as Saint Olaf, is one of the most divisive figures in Viking history, remembered either as the man who brought Christianity to Norway or as a ruler who forced it through violence. Depending on who is telling the story, he spent much of his reign trying to reshape Norway's identity, replacing old Norse beliefs with a new religious order, often using force to make that transition happen, earning both loyalty and deep resentment. Eventually, a coalition of Norwegian chieftains, many of whom opposed his rule and preferred foreign alliances, drove him out of his own kingdom. But Olaf didn't disappear into exile. He returned, determined to reclaim his throne. In 1030 AD, he marched back into Norway, knowing he was outnumbered, facing not foreign enemies, but his own people. At the Battle of Stiklestad, his forces were overwhelmed, and according to later accounts, his death was almost symbolic, struck by multiple weapons at once: a spear, a sword, and an axe. As if his end had to match the weight of his legacy, he fell not as a victorious king, but as a defeated ruler on his own soil. Yet what happened after his death is what truly defines him. Within a year, he was declared a saint, and in the end, Olaf didn't just lose his kingdom. He was turned into something far more permanent. Harald Bluetooth. Harald Bluetooth was the kind of ruler who didn't just inherit power, he reshaped it, uniting the Danish tribes under a single crown and extending his influence into parts of Norway. But his most lasting impact wasn't conquest, it was transformation. He oversaw the Christianization of Denmark, shifting an entire region away from its pagan roots, and he marked that achievement in stone, literally, through the famous Jelling stones, monuments that still stand today as a declaration of his rule and his faith. But for all his power and control, his downfall didn't come from a rival king or a foreign army. It came from inside his own bloodline. His son, Sweyn Forkbeard, led a rebellion against him, turning the stability Harald built into a battlefield. During the conflict, Harald was wounded, not killed outright, but weakened enough to lose everything. He was forced to flee his own kingdom, the land he had unified now rejecting him. And sometime around 986 AD, he died in exile, far from Denmark, far from the power he once held, likely in what is now modern-day Poland. His story ends not with victory or legacy, but displacement. A king driven out by his own son. The man who united a nation couldn't hold his own family together. And in the end, he didn't lose his crown to an enemy. He lost it to the very future he created. Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada is often considered the last true Viking conqueror, a man whose life reads like a full saga on its own. Before ever becoming king of Norway, he fought across continents, serving as a Varangian guard in Byzantium, battling through Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond, building both wealth and a reputation that made him one of the most experienced warriors of his time. But it was his final campaign that would define him. In 1066, he invaded England, seeking to claim the throne. And at first it worked. His forces defeated the English at the Battle of Fulford Gate, proving once again that he was a commander to be feared. But just days later, everything unraveled. King Harald Godwinson marched his army north with unexpected speed, catching the Vikings completely off guard at Stamford Bridge. Many of Hardrada's men were unprepared, some without armor, believing the fighting was already over. The battle turned quickly, and in the chaos, Harald was struck and killed, reportedly by an arrow to the throat, a sudden, brutal end to a lifetime of warfare. His invasion fleet had arrived with around 300 ships, but after the defeat, only a fraction were needed to carry the survivors home. And with his death, something larger ended as well. Not just a campaign, but an era. Because after Harald Hardrada, the age of Viking invasions effectively came to a close. Cnut the Great. Cnut the Great was the most powerful Viking ruler to ever live. A king who didn't just raid kingdoms, but controlled them. At his peak, he ruled England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, forming what historians call the North Sea Empire, a stretch of power so vast it connected multiple cultures under one crown. And unlike many rulers of his time, Cnut didn't rely purely on violence. He governed. He stabilized. He built something that looked like it might actually last. He is often remembered for the famous story where he commanded the tide to stop, but the truth behind it is far more revealing. He did it to prove a point, showing his courtiers that even a king has limits, that power has boundaries, and maybe that awareness is what made him different. But even that wasn't enough to preserve what he created. Around 1035 AD, Cnut died, likely from illness, still relatively young, somewhere between his late 30s and early 40s, and almost immediately, everything he built began to collapse. His empire didn't hold. It fractured, divided among his sons who quickly turned against each other, dismantling the structure he had spent his life constructing. Within a few years, the North Sea Empire was gone. The man who had held multiple kingdoms in one hand left behind nothing that could survive him. And in the end, his greatest achievement wasn't destroyed by enemies. It was undone by succession. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See what's next.